All right. Hey, everybody. Hello, good afternoon. I give it another few seconds for people to come in. A warm welcome to this 10th session of this monthly webinar series on emissions trading schemes for policy practitioners. It is hosted by the International Carbon Action Partnership, ICAP, with the support of the European Commission and jointly implemented by Ecologic Institute, Get2C and ICF. My name is Camilla Bausch. I'm the director of Ecologic Institute, which is an environmental think tank headquartered in Berlin and just being voted first among environmental think tanks globally. Today's seminar is called Making the EU ETS Fit for 55. So the EU emissions trading scheme Fit for 55, 55% emission reduction. More than 15 years after its launch, the EU ETS is undergoing one of the most significant reforms to date. And this is intended to align the European policies to the accelerated climate ambition of the European Green Deal. On 14th of July, 2021, so this year, the EU Commission presented the Fit for 55 package of legislative proposals to revise basically the entire climate and energy policy framework of the EU, including the legislation on the EU ETS, which aims to strengthen and extend to new sectors. If all the proposals of the Fit for 55 package are adopted, around 75% of the EU emissions will be covered by a carbon price. What does this extension mean for the decarbonization of the European economy? And what lessons have we learned under the EU ETS over the last 15 years? How can these lessons actually inform jurisdictions implementing or exploring emission trading schemes as a pillar of decarbonization around the world? This is what we're going to discuss today with some of the most exquisite experts in the field. But let me have some housekeeping remarks up front. First, this session will be recorded. The recording, as well as all the presentation materials of this session, will be made available on the project website. The link to the project website will be posted by my wonderful colleague, Leon, in the chat. You can find it right now. Second, how will this session today flow? So the 90 minutes we have together will first start with panelists provide introductory statements and reacting remarks. This is the first half of the webinar. Then this will be followed by a discussion with the audience in the second half. The discussion will be structured like this. You can put and post your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom. You find that on the bottom of the screen. Please use the Q&A and not the chat function. So when you do use that Q&A function, quickly introduce yourself. So who are you? Which organization do you represent? And then if you have a specific person you want to address this question to, name that person. The question will be later on taken up in the order of appearance, unless they are upvoted. You can upvote a question by liking it. If it gets many likes, it will come to the top of the questions page. I will then read them out and let's see how many questions we can cover. And again, please do not use the chat function. Now, but before we come to the discussion and our initial input, we will have a quick look on the mood in the room by using a Mentimeter poll. There will be a quick interactive poll, and to participate, please visit www.menti.com. You find again in the chat the link and the code. So I would like you to visit that Mentimeter poll quickly so we can see what the mood is in the room. I will give you a few seconds for that. So, for the first question, which sectors are currently covered by the EU ETS? We can already say we have an expert audience here because they are all right. Oh, don't go to power generation and industry. It's power generation, industry, and inner European aviation. So here we go. So I think for the first question, that was a warm up, and we can go to the next question. Is it a good idea to set up a separate emissions trading scheme, so emissions trading scheme 2, for road transport and buildings? For the newcomers to the meeting, would you be so kind, Leon, to post the Mentimeter link again? But here we have a clear mood in the room that no, there should be one emissions trading scheme covering all sectors, but there are minority opinions as well in the room, which I also am part of. So that will be something interesting to discuss later on in the panel, on the panel with the audience, because seemingly here, different to the first question, we have a very different views in the room for the second question. Let's turn to the third question. What role should emissions trading play in decarbonizing road transport and heating in the EU? So again, a very diverse view in the room. The clear majority is should be one element among others in the instrument mix. That's a group I belong to as well. But that is something to be discussed, especially because should be the main driver of emission reductions seem to have a lot of traction as well in the room. So we turn to the next question. Do you agree or disagree with the statement that proposed reforms of the EU emissions trading scheme will take the EU a good deal closer to climate neutrality? Here it's an aggregate number, so we don't see how much diversity is in the room, but we will see an aggregate number. And oh, there we see the diversity in the room. There you can see. So overall, there is a positive mood for the emissions trading scheme in the room, adding up to 7.2 points overall. But some outliers are there who are also rather critical, it seems, if I can read that from the numbers. So another thing to be discussed, while overall carried by the sentiment that this is a positive element. So thank you very much. With this, we close the Mentimeter exercise. And I think this helped us set the scene for what we are going to engage in now. So our first kickoff presenter of our wonderful panel will be Damien Meadows. Damien is head of unit for international carbon markets at the DG Climate Action at the European Commission. Many of you know him for years or decades because he's basically with that topic field what feels like forever. So one of the most prominent experts in the field. And I couldn't imagine any better person to explain the Fit for 55 approach to us. So thank you, Damien, for being with us today. And the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Camilla. And hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you today for this discussion. And just seeing the range of views, I think that's great because there has to be this diversity of views. And I'll work my way through just a dozen or so slides just quickly, but I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and the discussion because Fit for 55 is right now a set of proposals from the European Commission. We're working with the European Parliament, with the Council to make these into laws that should take us a long way to economy-wide carbon neutrality. If I just go to my, I don't need to prompt myself for my own slide presentation. So, I mean, Camilla's right. I mean, apart from a few years, I've worked on climate most of the time since 2000. And this has been a deadly serious topic since then. I mean, Greta Thunberg says nothing different to what Jacques Chirac was saying 19 years ago, albeit he said it in French, Notre maison brûle. And it is time to increase action. This has been known since the 1960s. And Europe is the most multilateral region of the world. I mean, we've brought the Kyoto Protocol into force. We brought Doha Amendment to it into force. And we always are looking for this global action. But meanwhile, I mean, you can see from the Mauna Loa measurements, we're off the scale compared to when I first used this slide at 414 parts per million. So we are, I think, entering into dangerous territory in terms of our collective failure to take sufficient action on climate change. And here, Barack Obama said this very eloquently in terms of needing to tilt the level playing field, needing to price pollution. Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, has been much more simple in terms of saying carbon emissions must have a price. Every person and every sector will have to contribute. But whether it's Bill Gates, whether I think it's Pope Francis, whether it's Elon Musk, people whose names you often don't hear said together, there's a pretty broad consensus that we have to make it more expensive to pollute if in market economies we are going to avoid catastrophic climate change. But the reality is more mixed. I mean, the US hasn't been able to have a federal carbon price. We're following with interest the discussions over the last months in the Senate, wishing well, but it's immensely challenging to get a US federal carbon price. Canada's done better, New Zealand's done better. Australia had a national carbon price for a brief moment in time. I think in relation to the road and buildings and whether sort of a system is more efficient if it covers everything, I've spent 20 years, I guess, involved in building an ETS that exists in practice. And I can remember people saying that's less efficient than a theoretical one, which covered everything. Possibly so, but it's far better to have a carbon price signal, to have a measure that brings down emissions. So the books we've written on this are freely available online. No one's looking for a profit here. And as Europe, we're very happy to share our experience, both the European Commission, member states, but also other experts in the field, Ecologic, those involved in ICAP. This system, I mean, we have now 16 years of experience. It caps emissions across almost half of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions, around 30 countries, and it's a market-based approach. The shift to auctioning has also brought another role to the ETS. Our member states have reported that they've spent 3/4 of the 80 billion euros that the system has raised since 2012 for tackling climate change. So I'll come on to this, but a lot of funding you see now, whether it's hybrid or whether it's the Icelandic mineral capture of CO2, the ETS is involved in funding these initiatives. We need this innovation, but you need a carbon price to make it interesting for industry to invest in the cleaner future. The emissions through the ETS outside of aviation have been decreasing considerably by more than 1/3 since 2005. And these are figures from before coronavirus, which of course knocked our economies sideways. Aviation, I'll have a slide or two. I mean, this was a later entrant into the ETS than sectors like railways that were in the ETS since 2005. Yeah, I'll have a specific slide on this. On the use of revenues by member states, the Commission often isn't that great at communications, but we do put the information out there. And I would recommend this climate progress report that we brought out just over a month ago, because this has figures per member state on what the revenue is being spent on. It's really important figures that help push back against some of those sometimes criticizing climate policy. And I think the Innovation Fund here, I'll also say a few words on it. It's very important. So in terms of delivering the European Green Deal, the aspect that I'll particularly be focusing on in my presentation is the economy-wide nature of action. I think we've seen the power sector deliver a lot. We've seen the chemical sector deliver a lot, some other industries delivering a lot. All of this isn't much good if we have free riders who don't contribute to tackling climate change. I mean, ultimately, emissions come from the entire economy. And I was very happy to see UNEP's GAP report basically in October, looking at the breadth of commitments of states and whether they're taking responsibility for things like aviation and shipping, because both of these sectors individually emit as much globally as I think the 150 poorest countries in the world. So they're significant emitters, and Paris says that countries like the European countries or the United States should take the lead by having economy-wide absolute emission reduction targets. Meanwhile, countries like China should move to economy-wide over time. So there's not a pressure on China or India to have a full economy-wide target, but under Paris, they're encouraged to move to this over time. The second aspect is solidarity and the need to work across society to make this transition. I think Executive Vice President Timmermans says this often, that we need a just transition or there will be no transition. So this has been in the ETS since the 2008 revision, elements of solidarity, transfer of allowances to less wealthy areas in Europe. Europe has discussed this with other countries around the world. I think it's very relevant wherever you are in terms of making sure that you get support across the economy and across stakeholders for taking climate action. I mean, even in the United States, a high-income country, West Virginia and others probably need special attention if you are to have carbon pricing. All sectors need to contribute. And of course, if there can be progress in UN fora, that's welcome. I think in our books, we highlight that some under Kyoto dreamed of a global top-down emission trading system. In the 24 years since Kyoto, I think we've realized that the world is pretty much more bottom-up. That's what we see with the Paris Agreement. But it's very, very clear that more action is needed. I can probably almost skip this slide for those in an ICAP seminar. I mean, the ETS is par excellence an industry-friendly system with an overall cap on emissions. Individual companies can increase, but they have a market incentive to reduce. The one element I would highlight, because of Camilla's questions to the audience, is in the Fit for 55 ETS proposal, we are crystal clear that given the urgent need for economy-wide emission reductions, member states should be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through other policies. I mean, particularly in discussions in the United States, there's sometimes still discussion as if carbon pricing were the only measure. And I think if we lived in that theoretical world, which was economically perfect, maybe that would be the case, but we don't. It's challenging to get policies in place. We have a climate crisis, and the Commission is saying very clearly that we need to price pollution and we need to have other policies. I mean, we can do multiple things at the same time, and we need to have policies that go in the right direction and remove policies that take us in the wrong direction. A couple of slides on shipping, because although I'll talk on road and buildings, I mean, the unique thing about aviation and shipping is they have no taxes, they have no VAT. So if you're driving a car in Europe, you're already paying quite considerable VAT, you're paying considerable fuel taxes. That isn't the case for sectors like shipping. And so if we want to move away from heavy fuel oil, move away from fossil fuels to cleaner alternatives, I think there's a pressing need to get price incentives that send you in that direction. Otherwise, you'll be talking about this for decades without change. So the Commission proposal on shipping has equal treatment on routes. I mean, it's obvious that if you don't have flag neutrality, you can't have an economic measure. Happy to discuss that in the Q&A, but I think we saw that clearly with aviation a decade ago. It's the same for shipping. Europe is taking a stepwise approach. We started off with monitoring, reporting, and verification. I think we've seen through ICAP and in discussions with all stakeholders, it's very important to have this MRV before carbon pricing. It really makes it easier to move to the next stage. So we propose covering the ships who are in European law for monitoring right now. But we propose less emissions responsibility for ships. So right now, a ship sailing from Europe to Shanghai is reporting its emissions under a current law. But we do not believe that Europe should be responsible for all emissions for a journey to and from China. Under the UNFCCC since 1996, so only for 25 years, there are 8 options on the table for countries to take responsibility for shipping and aviation emissions. 5 of them are preferred, and one of these 5 is taking responsibility for 50% of emissions. And that's what the Commission is proposing. We could have a whole seminar. I actually had a whole seminar last week on this issue. That 50% is the right amount for Europe to be responsible for. And when China feels ready to take its responsibility for the other half, then it would be great if it does so. And obviously, if we can make progress in the IMO, if we can make progress in the International Civil Aviation Organization, these are also good things to happen. But our proposal from July is fully consistent with common but differentiated responsibilities, which I think is critically important. There's also a phase-in. I mean, another lesson we've had on emissions trading is try and move to auctioning over time. There are many reasons why auctioning makes sense. For shipping, I remember in 2013 chairing working groups where people, I think, pretty much concluded free allocation in shipping would have been tremendously difficult. I mean, dredging and passenger ferries are very, very different to crude oil tankers, tramp shipping and cargo ships. So to try and find a way that everyone considered fair of allocating, that would have been tremendously challenging. Instead, the Commission has proposed that shipping is phased into the ETS over time, but also that the revenues be used to tackle climate change. And here, I mean, my personal view, I'm incredibly impressed by the shipping sector and their involvement in looking for funding for innovations. There are already ports and projects going through the Innovation Fund relating to renewables, batteries, for ships and for ports. And when I see what can be done in this sector, it's incredibly impressive. I mean, there's projects being put forward for hydrogen-powered passenger ferries. And yeah, I mean, the shipping sector is able to benefit from the Innovation Fund in full once the ETS revision goes through. And I think this probably could be a better use of these revenues than if people had attempted to have a system for free allocation. To just come to the other sector I wanted to highlight because of economy-wide action. Now, aviation is contributing to the ETS for a decade, including 500 airlines, about 100 of these airlines being based outside Europe, but flying within Europe. And the airlines that fly most within Europe, I think, are Federal Express and UPS, two American companies that I think are responsible for about a quarter of the cargo-related emissions from flights within Europe. And here, I mean, the ETS originally covered a wider scope, and the clock has been stopped on that wider scope for the last 8-9 years. The crucial legal issue was always whether Europe regulated airlines based outside of Europe. That we have done successfully. Aeroflot, Saudia, even Donald Trump, if you Google Donald Trump aviation ETS, you can see that there was initially resistance to Europe having a level playing field, but the member states were able to prove that we will enforce a level playing field for flights which European carriers are also flying on within Europe. So this aviation inclusion has actually been a success. It often hasn't been reported in the media like that because, as I said, I mean, the Commission doesn't always communicate well. We did have greater ambitions back in 2012, but there's an effective price signal. And even the European Airline Association says that it's delivered emission reductions around 200 million tons, albeit much of this from other sectors. We're now entering into co-decision on this. The Commission's made a proposal in relation to carbon dioxide emissions only, but we are very upfront pointing out that there are wider impacts of aviation emissions. In fact, they're 2 to 4 times the CO2 emissions alone. And we've highlighted this in carbon market reports. Hopefully other regions of the world as well in impact assessment and so on can take account of these wider impacts, because otherwise we're really not solving the climate problem. So the two main things we've proposed for aviation under Fit for 55, the first of these is phasing out of free allocation for aviation. We've got a 200-page impact assessment looking at these issues, and our general view is that airlines pass through costs to customers. If you buy a ticket from Brussels to Madrid, you'll be paying for fuel, you'll be paying for staff, you'll be paying for the cost of the aircraft, and you'll also be paying for the cost of the carbon on that flight. And that's precisely because there's equal treatment on routes. There are issues, would you fly to Morocco instead of Madrid? These kinds of things. These are issues, but they're not classical carbon leakage. So we're proposing that something like €1 billion of free allocation at the moment be transitioned to full auctioning by the year 2027. We're not proposing to extend ETS further than it is today in its classical €50 plus carbon form, other than a small element relating to the outermost regions, because Europe's Paris commitment is for minus 55% reductions economy-wide for Europe. And of course, the outermost regions are part of Europe, the Canaries, the Azores, Réunion, these are part of the member states. And it would be difficult to leave emissions from these flights out of our policy action. I think that could be criticized. But we're not proposing to extend the ETS any further than the outermost regions. because the other thing we're doing is proposing to implement the CORSIA system of the International Civil Aviation Organization. If in the Q&A people want to know more, I'm more than happy to discuss, but I won't abuse my platform now to give you too much detail on this. Safe to say that there's an important interaction between different UN fora. Europe supports the Paris Agreement very strongly. Also with the United Kingdom, non-regression was a very important principle when it came to our post-Brexit treaty relationship. And so Europe, the Commission is not proposing to backslide on what we have today, which is an ETS that covers intra-European flights, including Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, but also departing flights to the United Kingdom and departing flights to Switzerland. So other than the outermost territories, we're content to keep our 60 euro or whatever carbon pricing measure for aviation within Europe, but not go backwards. But then we propose applying this CORSIA system to all long-haul flights of European airlines. Now, Europe always supports global action, but of course we can't deliver it by ourselves. We want the United States, Canada, Japan, Russia, China, India, Brazil to also do this. And from 2027, ICAO says that the system is mandatory. So we should see Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping also applying this system. In our proposal, we provide some incentives for countries to participate in CORSIA, only applicable to European airlines, of course. But I think we're the first party to say that we will provide demand for Article 6 credits, as agreed in Glasgow, for European airlines to purchase them. There's an unequivocal statement in our proposal that European airlines can use Article 6 credits, provided there's no double counting, where the Glasgow rulebook, I think, is very helpful in that regard. We also say countries have to be a party to Paris to benefit from selling credits to European airlines. I mean, that's probably only relevant to the United States if there's a change of administration. It's one reason why we would hope the United States would stay in the Paris Agreement. We also hope that countries will be part of CORSIA if they're planning to sell credits. The only other element I wanted to highlight here is the importance of the level playing field. That is throughout our proposal something we absolutely insist on. So if others have lower standards than Europe, it's always possible for us to lower our standards, although that's hardly the race for the top that we hope to see post-Glasgow. Innovation and deployment, I wanted to say a few words, because to look at only the carbon price, I think, is only half the picture. The ETS is giving very strong incentives for innovation. The amounts of biofuel used are absolutely tiny. I think it's 0.05% of total aviation emissions are covered with biofuels. But this price incentive is there in a market way already today. If you add to that the use of auction revenue, which I've spoken on, and now what's coming from the ETS Innovation Fund supporting hybrid, carb fix, and things like this, there are tremendous opportunities for industry, for society right across Europe from the Innovation Fund. And in particular, the new idea in Fit for 55 of contracts for difference. I mean, whether it's hydrogen-based railways on non-electrified lines, whether it's road, aviation, these contracts for difference could do really impressive things. I was reading an industry figure that electrofuels for aviation may cost 3,000 euros per ton. Personally, I can't see Ryanair using these fuels unless there's a regulatory or a market incentive to do so. And it's the ETS which can create that market incentive. In addition, I think the ETS Modernization Fund is overlooked often. It's a shame because it's, I think, really important. It's this element of European solidarity, support for the less wealthy member states, and it's likely to be well over 20 billion available to support renewables, to support energy efficiency and a just transition. My penultimate slide, I think now, because I'm probably running up against time, is on road and buildings. These sectors have been increasing their emissions between 2014 and 2019. Buildings have gone up 2%, road by 7%. So in the context of a multiplicity of instruments, I mean, we know that we still need road taxes here. We know that the CO2 standards for cars are really, really important. The Commission thinks carbon pricing can also help us reach the goals of economy-wide emission reductions. And this is both through having a carbon price, but also the way that these revenues are used. Unlike shipping, which is a pretty small sector for inclusion in the total ETS, the Commission takes a cautious view. In terms of the survey that took place at the beginning, we believe road and buildings should be a separate ETS because of the large scale of the emissions, the sort of trailblazing nature of setting up this separate ETS. But the emissions trading system, its registry, its MRV rules, this is the legislative infrastructure to set up such a system. And because of solidarity, this social climate fund, I think, will be very important for the rollout of heat pumps, district heating, these kinds of things, which are really important socially when you price carbon. My final slide now, to end on maybe a lighter note, maybe not. Just the cartoon, I think, from the New York Times, just no matter how bad coronavirus has been, it is not as bad as what we're facing with climate change. Ursula von der Leyen has been a fantastic Commission president, both on coronavirus, but also her recognition that Europe must invest in a cleaner future. This is what we're doing. This Washington Post cartoon about those sectors who are saying, you know, just give us more research money, more subsidies. We need to price pollution as one measure to reduce emissions. I think you're entitled to be cynical if you see a sector saying just technology, no price incentives. And Europe, we have so much experience to share on how you can take action as a group of 30 countries. I mean, ideally as a group of 180 countries, but in reality, learning by doing, learning from each other, these kinds of things are absolutely crucial to avoid catastrophic climate change. So with that, I'll turn back to Camilla and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damien, for this excellent introduction. I think you can stop sharing your slide now. Thank you so much. And without a lot of further ado, I will turn to our two commentaries. I start with Ingvild Sorhus. I hope I somehow pronounce it correctly. She is lead EU carbon analyst with Refinitiv, and that is a global provider of financial market data and infrastructure. And she is a renowned expert. And please, Ingvild, what do you think of what you have just heard about the Fit for 55 approach?
Thank you, Camilla. It's a pleasure to be here. It was very interesting what Damien said. I have some slides I'll share with you. So I work as a market analyst, where we focus on both short-term market dynamics and also follow closely what's going on in Brussels and in other countries across Europe with regards to climate policy. So I'll in my small intervention, I'll focus a bit on carbon price and how the market is reacting to Fit for 55. So I think we already see a price support from EU's climate ambition. I mean, this price chart is showing historic prices 3 years back in time. It's been running for many years, many more years than just 3 years, but I just focus on these 3 years. So we over the 3 years, we've seen prices go from 7 euros to above 70. Today, we've been above 75 euros as well. And I think we have headed into a new era when it comes to the EU ETS. I think kind of one milestone was the market stability reserve start. Kind of that was the balancing tool of the markets of the EU ETS, tackling much of the kind of the problem that has been lingering with the EU ETS for so many years, this oversupply problem, and that European policymakers have tried to kind of make fixes along the way, and they're always being kind of accused of running behind a little too late in order to kind of provide EU ETS that delivers a price signal to drive emission reduction. So I think kind of this market stability reserve, we had a tripling in prices in 2018, and that really kind of kickstart the new future of the EU ETS, I would say. Because in 2019, that was the first year where we saw kind of a carbon price being actually working with as it was supposed to do. We had reduction in emissions of 9% over from 2018 to 2019, and much of that came from fuel switching. So kind of phasing or kind of switching from more emission-intensive power production to less emission-intensive power production. And I think kind of this year of 2019 and start of market stability reserve and the price response to that really kind of brought this renewed confidence in the EU ETS as a policy tool. And then in the end of 2019, Ursula von der Leyen came out with a Green Deal, of course, saying that Europe should be the first carbon neutral continent, and also that this existing 2030 emission reduction target was insufficient, and that the European Commission would then come forward with a proposal of somewhere between 50 and 55% emission reduction target the summer of 2020. Then in 2020, we all know that that was a quite special year. You had the coronavirus hitting the carbon price as well. And it was quite early, quite imminent or kind of visible that it was going to be quite weak fundamentals in 2020. Activity was dropping. We're expecting quite low emissions or much lower emissions in 2020 compared to kind of a normal year. But still the carbon market or the carbon price recovered quite rapidly. And I think kind of this support from this kind of anticipation that you would get a new 2030 target and that it would kind of mean less room for emissions going forward. Then in the summer 2020, there were kind of rumors that the Commission would go for the most ambitious of in this target range. And they did go for at least 55% target in 2030. And then in December, member states also kind of agreed that this was a good idea and agreed that kind of, yes, the new target of Europe should be at least 55% below 1990 levels. So going into 2021, that was kind of, everyone knew that, okay, that's the target. We have kind of a strong target. And then in July, we got this Fit for 55 package, fleshing out the details of how the framework should look like, or kind of how the Commission proposed that the framework should look like for the EU ETS and kind of the EU ETS contribution towards at least Fit for 55 or a 55% target. Of course, I must kind of stress that it's been a special year in other ways as well. We have had a really tight energy complex. Gas prices, electricity prices have gone through the roof. And carbon and the increase in carbon price has also kind of been tightly linked to the increase in the tight energy complex. But I think we wouldn't have seen kind of 70, 75 euro prices or perhaps above 50 if it hadn't been for this underlying support from the policy package. So Damien said that Ursula said carbon emission must have a price. And I think for at least emissions covered by the EU ETS, that yes, carbon emission has a price now with a price above 70 euros. So We know that emission trading is one of the desired tools to get to minus 55%. And with a high carbon price, it's providing a price signal that is needed to kind of bring the decarbonization fast forward. And I think also kind of an important element that has been mentioned by Damien and stressed by Damien as well is kind of the EU ETS is generating a lot of revenues that can be used for this shift that we are going for in Europe. In 2021 or so far this year, it's the revenues from the auctions are up 72% from 2020. And that's kind of despite that the auction volumes are considerably lower in this year compared to last year. So these revenues are kind of fueling into the innovation fund, it's fueling into the modernization fund, and also to the member states that can use these revenues for climate purposes. However, is it kind of, I mean, we all probably agree that we need a high price of carbon and I need a high price of carbon to get to where we need to be. But the question is, has it go too high too soon? This year, we've seen carbon prices rising 130%. Only now in November, we have seen prices rising 31%. And of course, with this current energy crisis in mind and with kind of this reopening of the directive, will kind of the policy discussions when framing kind of the long horizons, will they be kind of untouched by kind of the energy crisis and kind of the high carbon cost that we are currently facing? So just kind of mentioning a few points. I mean, we know the overall target, and that's kind of in law. We know that it's going to be climate neutrality in 2050. We know that it's going to be at least 55% target in 2030. But there are quite a lot of elements that still can be changed compared to where the Commission from the Commission proposal, and still kind of get to the final goal. Last time when the directive was reopened, politicians decided to strengthen the market stability reserve. This is the supply balancing tool and has really kind of been one of the superhero and kind of gotten the confidence in the EU ETS as a system. But kind of when you were strengthening the market, that was kind of a response to prices being at €5 level. And of course, now we're in a completely different environment. Will kind of now policymakers be reluctant to strengthen the market stability reserve or other elements of the directive? Of course, there will also be kind of worries about kind of industry. How will industry survive in Europe with a tight cap, high carbon price, and the gradual proposed gradual phase out of free allocations when you kind of implements carbon border adjustment mechanism. So, of course, all these elements are kind of a bit in play now. I'll just kind of go into the market stability reserve and just look at the design parameters and just see how that can impact the price. So in the proposal by the European Commission, they kind of really said that you need a stronger market stability reserve is still kind of crucial to make sure that the market is balanced when decarbonization speeds up. It's proposed to be a buffer MSR. So you'll keep kind of a 24% intake rate, which is kind of the intake rate of the market stability reserve now. It's removing 24% of the total number of allocation in circulation. So really kind of the oversupply of the market. So holding back from the market and then putting them into the reserve instead. how it's originally set out is to kind of keep a 24% intake rate for the first 5 years of operation and then go back to a 12% intake rate. In the proposal, it says that it should keep the 24% intake rate as long as it's needed. So when the market is closer to be balanced, it will gradually kind of lose its importance or kind of lose the strength of the intake rate. What we see when we do kind of our modeling is that with this buffer MSR, it will remove or it will take up 20% more than under the current setup, where it kind of revert back to a 12% intake rate. And then again, kind of 8% lower than with a 24% intake rate all the way. Of course, how the design of the market stability reserve won't change the overall target for the EU ETS as such, but this will kind of be one of the important design elements of the EU ETS when it comes to price formation and supply and of the demand balances. This dark blue line is showing our price forecast until 2030. We're getting to kind of 100 euro towards 2030. But we see kind of the development in the rapid greening of the power sector kind of needs MSR to come to the rescue, so you don't get kind of this oversupply started to rebuild again. This turquoise line is showing how a weaker MSR than with the current setup will be developed when it comes to prices. So of course, this is just one of the elements that we will kind of keep that will kind of be important to follow and will be up for discussion going forward. So I think that was it for me, Camilla.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ingvild, to showing us a practical approach to the numbers and what it means for the markets. Much appreciated. And now we come to our last input and comment by Sam van der Plas. He is Policy Director at Carbon Market Watch, and that is a well-known non-profit organization that advocates for the robustness and integrity of carbon markets. So the next 10 minutes are yours. Sam, please.
Thank you very much, Camilla, for that kind introduction, and thank you to ICAP for the invitation as well. I don't have slides, so I'll focus on also responding to what was said earlier. And I think it's important to keep in mind when we're discussing this ETS review specifically, it was mentioned earlier, it's part of this whole Fit for 55 package proposed by the European Commission. And I believe only one of the 15 legislative proposals which are in front of policymakers in the European Union currently. And therefore, I mean, this is important to keep in mind because I think it cannot and it should not be considered in a vacuum. And I want to make a few comments specific to that before going into a bit more of the sectoral appreciation of the EU ETS specifically, is that this 55% target agreed now to be delivered by 2030, of course, represents meaningful progress compared to the earlier commitments, also enshrined in the European NDC of 40% emission reductions by 2030. But at the same time, and this is also a strong NGO perspective coming in here, we believe this is still inadequate to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and specifically limiting dangerous global warming to 1.5 degrees. And therefore, I want to make this clear at the onset as well that the European civil society still believes that the target should be upgraded to 65% emission reductions by 2030. This also needs to be reflected in the review of the European emissions trading system. So I'll move on, focusing on the topic of the discussion today and the review of the emissions trading system, basically going over, I think, a few sectoral perspectives building on what was said earlier, and I'll start picking up where Ingvild left off on the notably the emissions taking place in the European power sector, where a lot of progress has been made in the past decade. The power sector in the EU has reduced its emissions under the ETS by more than 40% in 10 years' time. And this is critical. A lot of progress has been made. This was also critical to the oversupply problem of surplus emission allowances, which emerged on the market over 10 years ago and which lingered around for a very long time. It took multiple review rounds, from backloading emission allowances to establishing the market stability reserve to strengthening the market stability reserve in order to recalibrate this supply-demand balance. And I think indeed with carbon prices 75 euros per ton today, this is a very different story from where we were just 3 years ago. It was 10 times lower, as Ingvild pointed out. We do see a downside risk still to the carbon price and potentially oversupply re-emerging on the market. And this especially takes place in the context of national decisions, member states deciding to phase out high-emitting infrastructure in the power sector, so that's mainly coal and lignite plants, independent of the market price signal delivered by the EU ETS, and for good reasons. There is need for diversification in the energy mix. There are air quality concerns related to having those having coal and lignite in the power sector. And member states do take these decisions, rightly so, in their own hands. One critical component, I think, which will need to be considered in the policy-making process is also the timeline of the German phase out for coal and lignite power plants. The new government coalition is aiming to do that by 2030 instead of 2038, as was foreseen earlier. Germany being one of the major emitters under the European emissions trading system, this will have a very meaningful impact on the supply-demand balance. And we think this is, for example, one of the reasons why strengthening the market stability reserve even further than what has been proposed by the European Commission deserves a very careful look. Then other part of the story are the industrial emissions, mainly energy intensive sectors under the EU ETS, like steel, cement and chemicals. It is very important to keep in mind that here unfortunately, I would say the default way of dealing with the emission allowances is still handing them out for free, including up to 2030. The majority of the emissions from those sectors will be covered by free emission allowances. Around 45% of the total emission cap under the ETS is still made up of free emission allowances. Around 5 billion free emission allowances are foreseen to be allocated between 2021 and 2030 in the ETS proposal presented by the European Commission. And I believe economics have a very suitable term for this. They call this a market failure because the external cost of the pollution is in this case not internalized in the market. At Carbon Market Watch, we have looked at this in more detail in the past, and basically, apart from the economic shortcoming, it also creates a disincentive to reduce emissions, because windfall profits are generated on the back of handing out free emission allowances. And this is also importantly translated into a lack of industrial decarbonization. When you look at these sectors and their emissions over the past decade in steel, cement, chemical sectors, emissions are basically flatlining in the past 10 years. And I think this is a real problem, also a real challenge for this EU ETS review round coming up, that the next decade should really be a lot more serious about ensuring industrial decarbonization in the European Union. And I think there is also good news, because the good news is that by reducing the free emission allowances in the system, more emission allowances can be auctioned, which increases the revenue raising potential. The numbers were shown earlier, and I would commend the European Commission to now also have proposed 100% earmarking of the auctioning revenues to be further reinvested into climate action. I think some of the criteria can be strengthened, member states can be held more accountable, but this is a very important principle going forward, because it means basically that putting a price on the carbon pollution and then smartly reinvesting the revenues to deliver further emission reductions, it's what really can create a virtuous cycle of carbon pricing and delivering emission reductions. By the way, these are also investments that can and should go to these hard to abate sectors, energy intensive sectors, where this type of innovation funding is critical. And I agree that deserves public support. So to conclude, I think, yes, this ETS review is fit for 55, but it's not yet fit for 1.5. So there's still some more work to do to deliver adequate emission reductions. And we believe there's also still more work to do to ensure that the polluter pays principle is properly implemented throughout the review of this directive. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the exchange.
Thank you very much, Sam, also for the critical remarks. And before we turn to the Q&A, and I want again to say, you can ask the Q&A. I will ask in the order as they appear on the screen, and you can upvote questions by liking them. So if you want a question to be answered, please vote for it. And if you pose a question, it's very much appreciated if you say who you are and which organizations you're with, so we know where the question is coming from. Having said this, I first want to invite both Ingvild and Damien to also switch on their videos. And I would like to give Damien the chance to react before we turn to the question to what you've just heard. Please, Damien.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you, Ingvild and Sam. I mean, I found it quite complimentary. I mean, I didn't cover the market stability reserve, the price evolution. I think these are all very important elements, but I was more focusing on the economy-wide element. I would agree with Sam that, yeah, we're not collectively in the world on track to 1.5. And I mean, the ETS itself isn't doing as much as, well, I mean, Europe can't alone achieve this 1.5. So Fit for 55 is quite a step forward in terms of the proposals, but we're clearly not there yet.
Good. If that is as far as you want to go for the moment, we turn to the question. And there's a question which has received 3 people supporting it by an anonymous person, and it goes to Damien and to Sam. So, Mr. Meadows or Mr. Van den Plas, do you see any WTO international conflicts with the CBAM and phasing out free allocation only slowly, free allowances only slowly? What should happen with the CBAM revenue, and should it be used for international climate finance? A rather complex topic, as Damien said before. We can also make a whole webinar on CBAM, but here, please, a succinct answer. I go Damien first. Sam, you can come in if you want to afterwards.
Thanks, Camilla. And I mean, just as I said, the EU by its nature will always look for multilateralism. I think in terms of the lawyers and economists in the Commission and the focus on trade, the Commission's pretty experienced in the WTO, and therefore I think it's clear that a proposal coming from the Commission is going to be WTO compliant. The phase out is carefully written so that as the CBAM comes in, the free allocation goes out. Now, obviously, you could take away all the free allocation. This would be, WTO compliance as well. What you can't do is you can't keep the free allocation, have la beurre et l'argent de beurre, have both measures at the same time. So WTO compatibility of the Commission proposal, I think it's always going to be there coming from the Commission. In terms of what's done with the revenue, I also hear on shipping, on aviation, I mean, people saying, let's spend money around the world. And I mean, this is with the European Parliament, it's with the Council now, and there is a need for climate finance globally. But I can also see I've seen submissions from countries saying you shouldn't regulate shipping, 50% of it, you shouldn't actually even regulate shipping within Europe. You shouldn't regulate passenger ferries between Norway and Sweden. And I mean, this just shows the need for more discussion. I mean, of course, there are reasons to give more finance to the rest of the world. I think the Commission the EU member states are the biggest donors, the biggest contributors towards the $100 billion of any part of the world. But should it particularly come from one part or the other of the ETS, I'd say that's a political question.
Thank you, Sam, please.
Yeah, just to complement that, and indeed on the WTO compatibility, we are not experts, and I happily defer to the experts and the lawyers, and the bright lawyers as Damien and the European Commission to comment to that. But I want to point out two things. One is the way this carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal impacts free emission allowances under the ETS. It acts, I believe, extremely slow. Because it would take away 10% of the free emission allowances for the sectors which are going to be covered by the carbon border adjustment mechanism on an annual basis, basically extending those to be phased out only by 2036. So that is an extremely long period, 14 years from today. And we don't think that extending this for another decade and a half will help the transition required in those industries, nor do I think it can be a meaningful signal to the EU's international trade partners. And the second aspect in terms of what happens to the revenues of the CBAM, those are currently foreseen to go to the EU's own resources, the budget. I think also here the international signal is not so clear, because you could argue that there is also a need for the EU to reflect some way of having differentiated responsibilities, the fairness and equity underpinning the Paris Agreement, and also looking at specifically, I think, least developed countries to give them some kind of special consideration in the CBAM regulation. I mean, it could be by ensuring that some of these revenues also serve to support these countries in terms of international climate finance, adaptation needs, etc. I think as a global signal, and also as a way to show support for international progress on this, that would be an important consideration.
Thank you so much. As I said, one could discuss a long time, but I want to cover as many questions as possible. So another one, vote supported by 3 people. Damien, to you. It's written by Romain Logier. Mr. Meadows, could you elaborate on the Commission's rationale for letting industry enjoy free allocation until 2035, while at the same time putting a carbon price on cars, fuel, and heating? It seems that industry should not get a better deal than citizens, especially that industry has barely decarbonized in the last 20 years. Damien, what do you have to say?
Sure, well, thanks for that question. I think, I mean, industry is exposed to a carbon price today. It has been since 2005. The way free allocation is given isn't removing the incentive for industry to reduce. It's addressing this issue of carbon leakage, that producing clinker in Morocco and importing it to Europe. I mean, this could circumvent a policy, not bring the environmental outcome. So I think, I mean, industry in Europe has a carbon price, that's clear. Should road and buildings have a carbon price as well? that's a political question. I mean, the reality is the emissions from these sectors are increasing. Now, how to reduce those emissions? Clearly, better car standards. I mean, the electrification, the progress in cars, things like this are really, really important. Can a carbon price have a role to play? I think it absolutely can. But I mean, in my presentation, I was urging sort of focus on those harder to reach sectors like aviation and shipping, where there hasn't really been a price at all, even through the road taxes that we have in all the member states of Europe. So ultimately, I mean, on climate, an awful lot has to be done more. And I think that would include more being done in road and buildings. But that doesn't mean that more shouldn't be looked for right across the field. And I think what you've got in Fit for 55 is a reflection of what more needs to be done across the economy while preventing carbon leakage.
Thank you very much. And though there's a sign that Vimix Ecologic would like to answer this question live, I think we skip that and turn to the next question, which is by Seras Levin. Will buildings/road transport have a separate carbon price to the rest of the emissions trading scheme? That seems like carbon has different value, but it is all carbon. Is not all carbon the same? Also, I appreciate that other policies are required, just like the Energy Efficiency Directive helped reduce emissions. So one is kind of a point of a statement, and the other one is on the different prices. And maybe, Ingvild, do you want to come in on that one? And then Sam or Damien, show a raise of hand if you want to come in. So it seems everybody, so be succinct, and Ingvild will start.
Yeah, I mean, of course, kind of carbon is carbon. I agree with that. But of course, I mean, the EU ETS, as it is now, is quite kind of carefully well balanced, a quite complex system with the industry and power sector. And as some mentioned, kind of maybe that has been kind of more successful for the power sector as of now, and that we are going to kind of need to lean towards kind of industry going forward, because industry also needs to kind of decarbonize in order to reach kind of the overall goal coming to climate neutrality in 2050. Of course, the abatement cost, kind of how much does it cost to release the abatement potential in the various sector, might kind of be vary quite a lot in, I mean, from transport to shipping to industry to power. Currently, it has been kind of the abatement options in the EU ETS has been kind of the easy measures have been more kind of in the power sector, whilst the abatement cost is quite different from various sectors. So that's why kind of it's probably kind of a good approach to at least start out with two different ETSs, where you kind of can figure out what's kind of the most or kind of a good carbon price for the various sectors to release the needed abatement potential that is needed also by transport and buildings. Yes.
Thank you very much, which links it to our Mentimeter questions at the beginning, which I like. Sam, and then Damien, and then the next questions.
Yes, just to add to that, I think in those sectors, specifically buildings and or heating and transport, it's important to realize there are a lot of non-market barriers in place in order to deliver decarbonization in those sectors. And some of the examples are for split incentives in the housing sector, where the owner, it's not necessarily the same person as the one who pays the energy bills. or in the transport sector, where if there are no alternatives for delivering mobility in certain regions, also here it becomes very difficult to say that suddenly you would go by public transport, or you have those investments materializing. And so that's why it's needed to make sure that first of all, complementary policies and measures stay in place for those sectors. They are strengthened. Think standards for CO2 and cars, energy performance standards in the building sector. And the second aspect, that you also ensure that when citizens are affected by carbon pricing policies in those sectors, that they have an alternative to go to. And especially if this happens in lower income households, where already energy costs make up a significant share of the monthly expenditures, these are not the people you want to drive into energy poverty on the back of implementing climate policies. That would be counterproductive, and I think that should be properly addressed in these proposals going forward. So I think here, I mean, the question on fairness was raised earlier. If we are expecting citizens to pay a carbon price, how can we then let industry get let off the hook and allow them to continue to pollute for free until way after 2030? I think that's a very good question. It's a debate which, for example, took place in the Netherlands very prominently just a year or two ago, where the government had to come back and also say, like, look, we do need to look at fairness more seriously and implement a carbon levy for energy intensive industries.
Excellent. Links also, again, part of your answer to the Mentimeter question, part of what we have discussed before. Damien, short and succinct, there are still a few questions and I want to cover as many as possible.
Sure. Well, just to, as I started off by saying, I guess there's a big difference between the economically optimal ETS and what we have in reality. So there are different carbon prices. And I mean, you can see in the Commission proposals for the CORSIA system, the ICAO system, we're proposing to implement it, even though we say that the carbon price there will be orders of magnitude lower. I mean, the credits you can buy for CORSIA are 1 or 2 euros, but we have a 70 euro carbon price for flights within Europe. If you look at what Wizz Air or other airlines are saying, who primarily fly within Europe, they're saying that is unfair. And they're also, people are saying it's socially progressive to have some pricing on aviation compared to road transport. So at the end of the day, these are political decisions where to land. But the road and buildings is proposed as a separate pricing system to the ETS. I mean, that was your fundamental question. Thank you.
Thanks, and we certainly do not want to drive people to fly because road transport gets so expensive. So anyway, the next question by Elisabetta Cornago. Would a price corridor improve the prospects for an ETS2, given it would ensure an upper and lower bound of carbon prices for consumer-oriented sectors such as road transport and building heating? Nobody specifically addressed, so I would take 2 of our 3 speakers. Whoever wants to come in is welcome to come in. Maybe I start with Damien, and Sam or Ingvild, if you want to come in, just raise your hand.
I'm happy if someone else comes in first.
Okay, then Sam first, Damien second, then next question.
Yeah, I think, I mean, with price corridors, having a floor is a good way forward, because that gives you predictability and you know that this is the minimum level. Ceilings are a different beast, I would say. I think it's important to then clarify how would that ceiling be met, because I mean, you have to make a choice. If it's a market-based instrument, then the price is going to be determined by supply and demand. And this is the way the ETS has been implemented, especially to avoid that it would become fiscal instrument in direction of taxation, which would require unanimity from all member states in order to be agreed. And I think that was one of the reasons why a volume market-based instrument was proposed. And the way this ETS2 is currently proposed, it looks similar to that. So I mean, and in addition, I think again it's perhaps more looking at how to implement this in a socially fair manner. When there are negative consequences, then identify the target groups where this is the case, and for the rest, the instrument will be one of supply and demand. But again, as was said earlier, it's a separate system without trading with power sector and industry sectors.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, there's not a lot I'd want to add to Sam's answer. I mean, the ETS has worked on volumes. It's got the market stability reserves, the proposal for a separate market stability reserve, looking at quantities. So if you start adding in price as well, you're starting to make a system very complex. I mean, I remember a colleague in the original ETS in 2001 saying this system is as simple as it can be. And he withdrew those words at a certain point. But I mean, we should always work to limit the complexity in the system while addressing exactly those issues Sam said.
Thank you. So more about the volume than the floor. Anyway, Ingvild, now a question directed directly to you and supported by two people, by somebody anonymous. What short-term measures do you recommend to tackle the energy crisis, but also keep the integrity of the emissions trading scheme?
That was a big one. It's probably not up to me to make some recommendation on what we should do to tackle the energy crisis. But what I can say is that, of course, it's quite complex. I mean, most of the increase that we have seen in the high electricity prices and in the energy crisis that we see in Europe now is not due to a high carbon price. I mean, it's a very kind of stressed global problem, especially when it comes to the gas market. It's not only in Europe that we have high gas prices. It's kind of this high demand on a global scale. So I think kind of course, it's tricky because, I mean, the politicians are under stress. It's not so much they can do about gas prices, high gas prices. It's not so much they can do about coal prices. But I think, and of course, the carbon price and the EU ETS is policy made. So in that sense, kind of this anticipation that could be policy change as well when we're kind of in the situation and a very kind of stressed situation as it is. But as such, I mean, there are no kind of really kind of short-term fixes that we can suddenly do some magic to the EU ETS to kind of lower the price of carbon or to solve the energy crisis. But I think kind of what we have seen both from the European Commission when they kind of came out with this toolbox, and also that, I mean, previous to that, kind of also Spain said that they would use some of these revenues that the EU ETS is generating towards kind of like measure to dampen the effect of high electricity prices for low income households. So of course, I think in Europe, we're kind of a bit different situation exactly because of this revenue that the EUAs are generating that now kind of can be used for this this impact on electricity prices. But I mean, the EU ETS is here to kind of reach a goal. I mean, we're going for decarbonization. It's a very kind of very stressed situation at the moment, and I'm kind of it's going to be interesting to follow the policy discussion on how this situation, which is quite extreme, will color the debate going forward, if kind of politicians are keeping the eye on the ball, or if this noise now is doing some things for the policy discussions.
Excellent, thank you so much. I will try to get two more questions, and the last question, as it is open, I will link to a 1-minute famous last statement that gives you a good minute, Damien, to answer the next question, so by somebody anonymous, supported by one person. What political barriers do you see in getting the ETS2 up and running? What role will the Social Climate Fund play in smoothing political conflict?
Thank you. And I mean, I think this is one of the most challenging bits of the Fit for 55, because, I mean, if you were only to have ETS and no other measures, that would not solve the problem or be socially fair. So that's not what the Commission has proposed. But as always in the Parliament and Council, there's lobbying in various directions, and having a clear understanding that we still need the car standards, we need the improvements in urban mobility, we need all these things. And I think Ursula von der Leyen, when she introduced the proposals, she was very much emphasizing the Social Climate Fund, I think, would be there a year before the pricing under road and buildings. I mean, we need to support, particularly in buildings. I understand that it's more of a social issue because, I mean, everyone lives in buildings, whereas a lot of the lower income population in Europe, not everyone is car dependent, some are. But addressing these issues head on and early on, I think, is important. I think we can get there, but there's also a diverse situation across Europe in terms of the situation in France is not the same as that in Poland or Bulgaria. So with the involvement of the rapporteurs in Parliament, with the member states in Council, it's challenging, but it's no different to the challenges we've been through before in the last 15, 20 years.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we come to the last question, but I want to invite all speakers also to look at the questions we will not be able to pose. And sometimes there's a name connected and you might know somebody, so you might either quickly answer with a link or so in the chat, or be aware what questions and reports are out there. But now I come to the very last question, which has been posed by anonymous attendee and supported by one person. There is a bit of talking about manipulation of the EU ETS market. In its recent report, ESMA stated that it does not have any evidence of manipulation, but would you say that the system is manipulation proof? So with this question, I would go for the final round, and I will go in the opposite order of your introductory statement. So I will go Sam, Ingvild, and then Damien for the final statement and an answer to this question.
Okay, I'll do my best to keep it short. The question here on manipulation on the market, indeed, I think those are in summary the conclusions from that report from the European Securities and Markets Authority. An interesting report. There will be more detail, I believe, published beginning of next year. Ingvild also mentioned the high ETS prices are currently mostly due to the high natural gas prices on the market. So I think it's a question how long-lived this situation is. It will, in the short term, depend on how cold this winter is going to be in Europe and how much demand there will be for natural gas. But it's fair to say that a lot of the anticipation is that by next spring, this situation will change and may inverse again, which has a cooling effect on the carbon prices. I think it's interesting to see that those who are very worried about high carbon prices right now, about speculation on the market, these are typically not the same voices, or at least people which we did not hear when carbon prices were 10 times lower. The ETS directive has already provisions. It's in Article 29A, which allow interventions in the market in case prices rise excessively high. So I think the long-term challenge to tackle the climate crisis is still what we should focus on, and probably not get too distracted by shorter-term price hikes. So I'll conclude with that. We did not have the chance to talk about reporting of European member states on the use of ETS auctioning revenues. But I do see a link to a very interesting WWF report in the Q&A here, which I think sheds a lot of light on how this is currently done and how it can be improved going forward. Thank you very much for the exchange. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Ingrid.
Yeah, so it depends a bit on what you kind of put into manipulation, but if we're talking about those non-compliance, those that don't need to be in this market for emission, because they have emission compliance. I would say that, I mean, it has, of course, kind of attracted more participants than those that had to be in this market for compliance reasons a few years back in time. I mean, we've seen kind of interest from banks, from hedge funds, from, and of course, I think that's also linked with the EU ETS as seen as high climate integrity. I mean, there are now people in the market that needs kind of to that are kind of engaging in the EU ETS to hedge their climate risk in their portfolio. It might be that they will see that they might be subject to a carbon price in the future. That might be shipping sector, or it might be kind of sectors that are kind of going to be exposed to a CBAM or an internal carbon price, but really don't have a mature market as of now. So of course, there are kind of various reasons of why these non-compliance entities are in this market at the moment. But of course, they kind of are also kind of adding liquidity to the market, yes, but it's also kind of adding to the volatility in the market. And of course, some of these moves that we have seen, I mean, now over the last week, when we saw kind of going above 70 and above 75, I mean, you have several reasons, like carbon specific reasons or like energy related reasons, but that it's a factor that there are some trading specific and technical analytics factors on top of that, that is sure. But I think kind of that we have seen kind of carbon prices rising. Of course, it's all to do about the higher climate ambition and kind of this long horizon that emissions need to be priced high in the future.
Excellent, which we have seen on your slide. Thank you so much, Ingrid, in the explanations why things rise. Now, Damien, your last words.
Thanks. And yeah, I won't comment on price because I think the standard Commission response is not to comment on prices. I think just to thank you and everyone who's participated in this webinar, because yeah, I mean, we know in theory, I mean, carbon pricing is an important way to reduce emissions. But in practice, I mean, Europe is the region with the most experience in this area. I remember when our carbon prices were low in the past, these change over time, and the system is incrementally made better over time. I mean, on that question of use of auction revenues, the EU isn't a super state. Most revenues are in the hands of member states, and I think NGOs and the Commission have a common interest in improving that reporting, making sure that the funds are being used to tackle climate change. When I look at the rest of the world, I mean, Europe's in a relatively good position in terms of we've been able to do it, whereas federally the US hasn't been able to do it. And I mean, with China, we've shared that experience. With others, we're sharing that experience. I don't think we're on track to limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees. I mean, that's a perpetual challenge in terms of we've got to do it in the next decade or two, and it's got to be done broadly by a range of countries and across the economy. But Europe is on the right track in terms of what it's doing, and particularly the Fit for 55 proposals. So this will be important next year or two. Hopefully improvements will be made during the legislative process. And I encourage everyone to stay engaged in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damien, also for putting all your energy into making us fit for 55, which we have to. And with that, I come to a close of this webinar. And of course, I first want to thank our wonderful panelists, Ingvild, Sam, Damien. That was really inspiring and most insightful. And the audience, which did give us all the questions we needed and even more than we could answer. So we need to continue this exchange. Thanks also to the European Commission who is supporting this webinar series, to ICAP for hosting, and to my wonderful colleagues behind the scenes who helped carry this session. I just want to mention Benjamin Görler, Leon Martini, and Michael Mealing, among others. Our next webinar installment of this series will discuss how to understand and address the distributional effects of emissions trading scheme. We kind of touched upon this today and is tentatively scheduled on 16th of December. We will announce further details on the ICAP training website. You can see that also in the chat right now. So please visit the ICAP training EU website. And the link is in the chat. So with that, many thanks, many best wishes to everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay engaged, and hopefully to see you soon in person again. Bye-bye from Berlin.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.